Good, good. Katie's here, which is the important person. I tried to send everybody an email just to see if yeah, other people are in the waiting room.
Hey, it's Katie.
Hi, Katie. We're gonna just wait and see if some folks, well, I guess we can keep an eye on such things. So I told Katie about this. Others didn't realize we had some real technical problems here in the classroom where we could not broadcast from the computer. And I guess I wasn't enough of a planner to have my computer with me. So, but we have a lot of people out here on the Zoom. We're very excited to talk about some t-shirts we're going to be giving away and some trips to DC we're going to be taking at the end of September. So those of you that are just joining us on Zoom, I apologize you couldn't hear us. Everybody, I guess Katie's responding to me, so I guess we can be heard okay.
Yep.
More people are in the waiting room. Look at this. All right, we're going to keep admitting folks in the waiting room as we go. So this is great. Here's more folks. So we have about 10 people in the waiting room. We've got about 15 to 20 people here. So that's not a bad audience. Yeah. So I don't know. I guess I'll just give a quick, do you want me to do the intro, Brock, since we're okay. We're really thrilled to have Katie here, manager of international or manager, I think, of international trade and customs at what I always call Price Waterhouse Cooper, but which apparently PwC now. And Katie, not too long ago, was president of this very club and had a really successful law degree at William and Mary. I believe she did some internships during that time that kind of got her foot in the door and some of the types of things she's doing today. We had Brian Riley already speak about kind of the positives of free trade and stuff like that. But Katie's really been living it even more, helping companies navigate issues and answering questions and doing all kinds of stuff. So we're really thrilled to have Katie here. We have the opportunity, if anybody wants to ask her a question that's in the room, just walk up and she'll see you, right? So that'll work. And I don't know if you have a screen to share or anything, Katie. If you do, I think that's allowed. I believe you can just share your screen and take over. So hopefully I didn't butcher the intro too badly, but we're thrilled to have you here.
Thanks. No, you did a great job. So give me 1 second to get my deck up.
I don't know. I haven't had my dinner because I've been sitting there staring at my sandwich for the last 45 minutes while I've been trying to get this thing up and running.
All right.
Yeah, you can share and then I'll just make sure it looks good and I'll go sit down.
Can you see the screen now?
And again, yeah, and if there's problems with the internet, go ahead and let us know in the chat. I don't know. I'm on K-State guest because I couldn't get K-State wireless to work. So hopefully this will be okay. But if there's a problem, put it in the chat and we'll try to fix it. I'm going to go ahead and minimize those folks just so we can all kind of see what you're doing. Yeah, looks great.
Cool. You guys can hear me okay?
Let me see how we can do the sound maybe a little better.
Okay.
Now that I think about it for our live audience, put it up to 100. That will help. You think we can do it on the? Okay, so let me do something with the sound here. On my laptop, you mean? Okay, what should I do? Yeah. Try that, maybe. Hello? Go ahead and say something, Katie.
How's it going?
Oh, no, that's not working. Okay. Do Zoom, maybe? No, okay, we got your screen. Hold on. Let's try again.
Can you hear me?
Are you speaking?
I was. Can you hear me?
Oh, there we go.
Yes?
Awesome. Okay, I'm going to go away. I am leaving the area right now while it's working.
Okay. Great. Well, I'm super excited to be talking to you guys tonight. What I'm planning to discuss is the past and future impact of the Trump tariffs. I know Brian touched on some of these topics when you guys had him last month, so there might be a little bit of overlap, but we're going to get more into the nitty-gritty on all of the different tariffs, the impact we've seen in the economy, and what we might see with the new administration. A couple of points before I start. I have 2 cats and they frequently like to make appearances on my Zoom calls, so you may see them popping in and out. Second is, I apologize for any background noise. The way my apartment building is set up, we can only have heat or air conditioning in any given season. And it was very warm here today, but I don't have air conditioning. So I have to keep my door cracked or else I will suffocate. All right, about me, as Dr. Keister said, I'm a manager in PwC's Customs and International Trade practice. I got my economics degree at K-State in 2012. I was president and secretary of the Econ Club, and you can see some of our great photos from some of our field trips. I believe that was to Chicago at the Fed in the bottom right, and our Econ banquet. Was involved in lots of other activities in my time at K-State. I got my law degree at William and Mary. I'm licensed to practice law in the state of New York. Since graduating law school, I went right into customs and trade consulting. So I've been doing that for about 6 or 7 years now. And I put my email down at the bottom. If you guys have any questions or want to follow up on anything, please feel free to email me. All right, so what do I do in my job? To summarize, most of what I do is to help multinational corporations navigate the ever-changing international trade environment, manage their customs duties and other trade-related costs, and adhere to any regulatory or compliance obligations. So that could be anything like FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, FCC, any types of those other government agency requirements, as well as customs requirements. But the emphasis of my work, especially the past several years, has been on tariff mitigation strategies and how I can help my clients implement different customs programs or strategies to lower their duty costs, most of which have risen due to the Trump tariffs. The most recent bit of trade news, though, was about the Ever Given container ship being stuck in the Suez Canal. So I hope you guys were following that. I know we were. I actually had clients who had shipments that were stopped up because of that. So we were definitely following that. And in my team, we always find it fun when trade pops up in the news for a reason other than some new tariffs being announced. All right, so we're going to start with a little bit of a primer on the timeline and the types of Trump tariffs that have been implemented. I know this is a lot of information. We're going to go over it fairly high level, but feel free to ask questions or drop a question in the chat. So the Trump tariffs really go back about 3 years now to February 2018. When the first Trump tariffs were implemented on solar panels and residential washing machines. And these were implemented under Section 201, which provides for safeguard measures, meaning that a domestic industry is being threatened by imports from other countries. And these were pretty big tariffs. They range from 20 to 50%. And to provide a little bit of background, the average tariff rate on goods coming into the US is about 2 to 3%. So very significant increase. This first set of tariffs didn't get a lot of attention because the scope of them was so small. It affected very few goods. We were surprised the following month when the 232 tariffs on steel and aluminum were implemented. So the 232 tariffs cover national security concerns. And the issue here was supposedly that steel articles were being imported into the US in such high quantities that it impaired the national security and was weakening our economy, decreasing US production of steel and aluminum. So these tariffs were very broad. They were imposed on steel and aluminum importations from almost every country. A few countries eventually did receive exemptions, countries that we have very strong trading relationships with, Canada, Mexico, as well as a few other countries. And those range from 10 to 25%. And at one point, the tariff on steel and aluminum from Turkey was as high as 50%. So again, compared to that 2 to 3% average, very high. Now, we also had a lot of tariffs that were proposed but never actually implemented. So those are in the kind of the lighter purple color. So there were national security tariffs proposed on automobiles and auto parts. Those never ended up being implemented. The next big set of tariffs, which you guys have probably heard the most about in the news, was the first set of tariffs on Chinese products. These were implemented under Section 301, which allows for measures to combat unfair trade practices. Now, what's really interesting is that Section 301 and some of these other tariff measures were used in small amounts in the 70s, 80s, and mid 90s until the establishment of the WTO General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which brought down a lot of trade barriers and got the member countries to agree on some more preferential trading terms. It also gave member countries a dispute mechanism. So if they had disagreements between each other, they could bring those to the dispute settlement body at the WTO, who would rule on the claims that were brought to them. So really from the mid 90s, we didn't see any of these types of tariffs being used until 2018, where we see them a lot. And typically, if we did have any concerns about dumping, which is goods being sold into the market below market value, or goods subsidized by a foreign government, those would be taken up through anti-dumping and countervailing duty proceedings, which are completely outside the scope of these tariffs. So the China tariffs were a big shocker. The first round that were implemented, the scope of them was pretty small. It affected only 34 billion of annual import value of goods, but the duty rate additional was 25%. In that same month, there were also some proposed tariffs on uranium. Those never ended up being implemented. Then in August and September, we had 2 more rounds of tariffs on Chinese products implemented. The round 2, list 2 is what we call it, covered about 16 billion in value. So again, smaller than the first list, implemented at 25% rate. The big whopper came in September with the implementation of list 3. This list covered about 200 billion in annual trade value. And that duty rate started about 10% and eventually increased the following year to 25%. This one was also really interesting too, because this tranche of tariffs started to affect a lot of consumer goods. Some of the earlier tranches in list 1 and list 2 did not hit consumer goods quite as much as list 3. So we had a little bit of a break for the holidays in 2018, and there wasn't quite as much action until March 2019, where there were some proposed national security tariffs on titanium sponge. I'm still not even sure what that is, but those did not end up being implemented either. The next big set of tariffs to kind of make the news were the proposed IEPA, or International Economic Emergency Powers Act, tariffs on goods from Mexico. And what's interesting about these is they were not proposed to combat any sort of trade issue. These tariffs were proposed purely to use as a bargaining chip to start conversations with Mexico about immigration at the Mexico border. So this was kind of the first set of tariffs where we saw the administration using these measures to further policy goals that were not directly trade related. And that's an important measure because we've never really seen that before. These tariffs were also unique too because they were proposed to start at 5% and increase by 5% every single month until some agreement was come to between the US and Mexico. Those never ended up being implemented either, which is, it's also very interesting because the USMCA, the replacement for NAFTA, was implemented around the same time that those tariffs were proposed. We had another little break again until September, when we had the fourth set of tariffs on Chinese products implemented. We call this list 4A. There was also a list 4B that was proposed that never ended up being implemented. And with those, Trump said he decided to save Christmas by not implementing those because they were set to go into effect around December. So we find that kind of funny. So list 4A also hit a lot of consumer goods. Those started at 10%, were increased to 15%, then eventually decreased, I believe, as part of the phase one China deal to 7.5%. Then we had the Section 301 tariffs on EU products. Now, what were really interesting about these is these are actually a result of a dispute settlement that was brought to the WTO. The WTO found after several years of this proceeding that the EU had unfairly subsidized production of Airbus planes. And as a result, the US was entitled to implement tariffs to combat that. Those were in effect for about a year and a half, and they were actually just suspended last month. To wrap up 2019,
Seemed to have lost for a second. I don't know if that's my end or your end.
Can you hear me?
Might be mine. Hello?
Hello?
Okay, we lost you for about 45 seconds, but I think okay. You're good now, although it says my internet's unstable. I think I'm just gonna take my chances with it though, 'cause it's been pretty good for the most part.
Okay.
But maybe go back, you talked about the reduction of the Chinese tariffs and
yes.
that might have been where you cut out.
Okay, no problem. So to backtrack a little, we had the reduction of the Chinese tariffs, which was kind of the first positive move forward we'd seen in the negotiations with China. After that, we had our first, I believe it was our first set of products or tariffs targeting EU products. And these were as a result of a dispute settlement at the WTO, where after several years at the WTO, they actually found that the EU had been subsidizing production of Airbus planes unfairly. And so they actually approved this set of tariffs. But these were actually suspended recently. And then, as I mentioned before, in December, we had the proposed additional set of Chinese tariffs, but they were not implemented and Christmas was saved. So all was quiet on the Trump tariff front for about a year. There were still other trade developments taking place. There was also COVID going on that had a lot of economic impacts. There was the implementation of the USMCA. There was the debates over Hong Kong's status as it related to China, and investigations into Vietnam's proposed currency manipulation. So a lot was going on, but no new tariffs for a little while. Then 2021 came around. We had just a couple months ago proposed tariffs on France, specifically because France wanted to put in place a digital services tax that the US government found unfairly discriminated against US businesses. Then several other EU countries also wanted to implement similar DST taxes. So we initiated 301 investigations against all of those countries as well. Now, again, just last month, the new administration, so the Biden administration, actually proposed new 301 tariffs on products from Austria, India, Italy, Spain, Turkey, and the UK. So even though those investigations were initiated while Trump was in office, the new administration is still following through on some of these tariffs. So I know that's a lot. And as all of these tariffs were being proposed and implemented, some of the tariffs had exclusion processes available, which we'll talk about a little later. A lot of countries affected by these tariffs, particularly the steel and aluminum tariffs, as well as the China tariffs, put in place their own retaliatory tariffs against US products. And for a couple of the tariffs, the list of products also changed several times. So a lot going on in the past couple of years. So what has the impact been of these tariffs? I put this office meme in, particularly for you, Dr. Keister, because I know you love The Office.
I'm moving you so I can see it.
Oh, okay. But I thought this was on point with a nice expectation versus reality meme. So the expectation of a lot of these tariffs was either to protect US industry or to punish a foreign nation for unfair trade practices. By increasing the cost of imported merchandise, the US comparative merchandise should theoretically be cheaper and more desirable to consumers. Now, in reality, did any of that happen? Not so much. Imports did decrease slightly for any of these covered products, depending on the product availability, and the availability of domestic substitute merchandise. Some US businesses continued to still import, but maybe chose to source from a jurisdiction that was unaffected by the tariffs. So instead of sourcing from China, maybe they went somewhere like Vietnam, Japan, Korea, somewhere else in Southeast Asia, depending on the industry. So maybe we did punish China a little bit, but the US importers were still importing as opposed to buying domestic. US importers and consumers as well ended up bearing most of the costs of the tariffs. Depending on the price elasticity of the good that we're looking at, either the US importer or the consumer would bear the additional costs of the tariffs. So I've put in some examples I wanted to go over that are real examples from my clients. So the first is luxury handbags, and these were targeted by some of those digital service tax tariffs. Luxury handbags tend to be price inelastic or not price sensitive. So the US importers were able to pass on most of the costs of the additional tariff to their consumers through the price increases, and they didn't really see any change in their sales, even though the costs rose. So this is a case where we saw that the tariffs, instead of punishing the EU countries for these discriminatory tariffs, were actually paid by US consumers. Another example is premium alcohol, which is actually very price elastic due to the high level of competition in the industry. So if if there's any price changes in the premium alcohol area, not the area of alcohol I buy in, so I cannot speak to this personally, consumers are very likely to switch to another brand that didn't raise their prices. So in these instances, the US importers had to absorb the additional tariff costs as a cost against their revenue. Now, the steel and aluminum one was a little more interesting. These tariffs were imposed, again, to protect national security interests and encourage domestic steel and aluminum production. US production did increase slightly, but what happened was US suppliers actually increased their prices to match the higher foreign prices that included the tariffs. So while that was beneficial to US steel producers, the US steel consumers had to bear the burden of those tariffs. Additionally, what I learned is that there are certain types of steel that the US does not specialize in and that are not readily available, that still must be obtained from abroad despite the increased costs. Another interesting observation I saw with a lot of clients is that they were able to negotiate prices with their foreign suppliers. So the base cost of their products were lowered so that when the tariffs were added, it ended up being the same price as prior to the implementation of the tariffs. So from my observations with my clients directly and how they were impacted by these tariffs, most of them and their clients ended up bearing the burden of these tariffs, and it didn't really seem like they were that effective for the intended goals. As I mentioned before, there were also retaliatory tariffs implemented, I think by over 20 jurisdictions on all different kinds of products. And these retaliatory tariffs make US exports more expensive in foreign jurisdictions, which really hurt businesses that rely on exports for revenue. Now, the last area I wanted to touch on here was exclusions. Now, specifically for the 301 China tariffs, but also for the steel and aluminum tariffs, the administration released a process where importers and other US interested parties could petition for exclusion from the tariffs. Now, depending on the product or industry you were in, exclusions were difficult to achieve. It's really interesting too, because we saw some exclusions granted due to lobbying efforts. The biggest one that was in the news was Apple and Apple Watches, because Trump and Tim Cook apparently had lunch together to discuss the tariffs. And then a couple of weeks later, the exclusion for Apple Watches was approved. The exclusions that were approved for the China tariffs were applicable to all importations of the specific product exempted, regardless of who put in the petition. So that at least leveled the playing field between importers, and one was not, having to pay the tariff and another was not. With the steel and aluminum tariffs, the exclusions were both product and importer specific. So if you, as the importer, did not file for the exclusion, you could not take advantage of it. Another thing with these exclusions is that theoretically, for them to be approved, you needed to demonstrate significant financial harm to your business or to US interests, but there was no other criteria or guidance provided on how to actually substantiate that to the government. Or you could also try to show that your product was only available in a jurisdiction affected by the tariffs and no domestic substitute good exists. This proved to be a pretty high burden for a lot of importers. We in our practice submitted dozens of exclusions for importers. I don't think any of them were approved. So it's pretty difficult to achieve those exclusions. The exception to that, and I think Brian might have talked a little bit last week, was for PPE and other COVID relief products. So the administration was pretty quick to provide tariff exclusions for masks, gloves, gowns, hand sanitizer, thermometers, things like that. And they're actually the only tariff exclusions to have been extended into 2021. All other tariff exclusions have expired at this point. The Biden administration is contemplating reopening that exclusion process, but that is still TBD. So were the tariffs successful? Maybe. It depends which one we're looking at. There were some negotiations over the digital services tax tariffs with EU countries. Some countries actually did end up deciding not to implement those taxes. Whether that decision was tariff related or not, I don't know that we have all those details. But there were also postponements of tariffs that were going to be implemented so that the two nations had time to further negotiate. So we are seeing a little bit of success with the EU countries and the DST tariffs. Where we're maybe not so successful is when it comes to China. You may have seen in the news in early 2021, there was a phase 1 deal made with China. China agreed to several things, opening up for foreign investment. But the biggest thing was that they were committed to increasing imports of US agricultural products, industrial products, and natural resources. However, over the past year, China only purchased about 60% of the committed amounts for at least for trade in goods. So China's not really holding their side of the bargain, at least where it comes to the phase 1 deal. And we haven't really seen any movement on the tariffs one way or another. So I found some snippets from some different research institutions or think tanks to show the impact of the tariffs on the economy as well. And some of these were actually pretty interesting, but they kind of echo, the observations that I made earlier in the presentation. So the tariffs in total, according to American Action Forum, have cost American consumers roughly $57 billion. At a household level, they're saying at least through 2018 and 2019, the impact was about $800 per household. The American consumers and firms paid most of the tariffs, and they necessarily have not helped us to negotiate any better trade deals or improve national security. I also found this modeling really interesting from the Tax Foundation. They have estimated that for the tariffs imposed, while we have an additional $80 billion in revenue, our long-run GDP, wages, and full-time equivalent jobs have all decreased because of the imposed tariffs, as well as the retaliatory tariffs that other nations have imposed on our exports. So what are the implications post-Trump with the new administration? The Biden administration admittedly has been a little preoccupied with COVID, the vaccination efforts, and that's definitely the most pressing issue right now. But they have come out and noted that the China tariffs are not going anywhere anytime soon. The new US Trade Representative, Catherine Tai, has come out and said that she sees the tariffs as leverage for negotiations with China. And as I mentioned earlier, the Biden administration has also proposed new tariffs related to those digital service tax investigations. The actions taken by the Trump administration have really paved the way for future administrations to use these different trade measures to implement tariffs not only to achieve trade goals, but policy goals. And that gets back to the point I mentioned about the Mexico tariffs. So based on the precedent set forth by the Trump administration, new tariffs can be imposed at almost a moment's notice. And what we're telling our clients is that if they're engaged in trade or have any sort of cross-border supply chains, they need to be hyper aware of where their products are sourced, the associated costs, and options to pivot their supply chain if needed. So I think that was all I had to cover. So I'd like to open it up for questions.
Hello.
Hi.
So I was wondering, you were kind of talking about it at the end there, but how you were talking to a lot of your clients about, having a plan to pivot and having a plan to, maybe move where you're sourcing things from. So doesn't that kind of mean almost that in the short term, obviously consumers are being impacted, but maybe in the long term, these types of things might actually like cause companies to try to source from places that aren't going to be as controversial, things like that?
Sure. So a lot of it depends on the industry and I want to say, what is the word I'm looking for? How well a supply chain has been thought out. For some companies, it is very easy to pivot to new suppliers in new jurisdictions that are not affected by the tariffs. But for others, there are certain industries that have developed supply chains that are very rooted in a specific geographic region. So I believe it was my client, a lot of footwear manufacturers are very, the industry has been developed throughout Southeast Asia, and it's very hard to source footwear at competitive costs outside of Southeast Asia. And that's another reason the exclusion process was implemented, was for importers to say, hey, these tariffs are really causing my business a lot of harm. You have to be able to prove it, and the government has to agree. But the exclusions that were granted were good for a period of 1 year. And the administration said, okay, within that 1 year, that should give you enough time to be able to look at your sourcing options and pivot outside of China to another country or to US manufacturing. So because these have been in place for a couple years now, we're kind of beyond that initial time period, at least contemplated by the government, that a company should be able to move its supply chain and source elsewhere. But that's really not, again, practical depending on the industry.
And just kind of following up on that, Katie, my interpretation is when this is sold, especially by former President Trump, it wasn't sold that people are going to quit buying from China and buy from Vietnam. The sell job is kind of, these jobs are going to come back to the United States. So even that, I mean, if you say, and at times it'd say, well, we want to punish China, we want to punish Europe, we want to do whatever, but that seems secondary to me. Maybe I'm misinterpreting. It's kind of the stated goal of the policy, which is made in America. Is that, I don't know.
I think the main goal of at least the China tariffs and a lot of the EU tariffs was definitely punish China, punish the EU, with the intended effect of bringing production to the US. But the intended effect was not necessarily the same as what actually happened. Now with the steel and aluminum tariffs, because those were national security based, the goal of those was explicitly to boost production domestically. So it varies a little bit depending on the set of tariffs we're looking at. But I would say for almost all of the tariffs, they did not have the intended effect.
Okay. And then I earlier, I put something in the chat and I was just kind of curious, like, and this is kind of your opinion as someone that follows all these things, like going into it ex ante, I mean, wasn't it fairly obvious that like the handbag tariffs were like particularly a bad idea just because of what you think of in terms of basic consumer and producer surplus and how that plays itself out. I just, yeah, I guess that's all I.
Yeah, so personally, I don't think many of the tariffs were well thought out. But the way at least the EU tariffs were targeted was, the administration was saying, okay, when we're looking at France, when we're looking at Italy, what are the types of products that the US sources most from those countries that are, specific to those countries? So we saw a lot of luxury goods, but we also saw things like wine and cheese that are sourced from Europe, or whiskey, scotch, cognac, things that have to come from Europe or are mostly sourced from Europe. The administration didn't necessarily take into account things like price elasticity. They were just looking more at the types of goods that they thought tariffs on those goods would be most impactful in their mind.
Well, and I think you saw with Brian, we had some took our shots at Wilbur Ross, I guess, and some of the basic econ that seems to be missing in some cases, in my opinion.
A lot of basic econ is missing.
Yeah. I don't know, and hopefully we get other people to come up here. I'll move out of the way. If we have other questions from the chat, just speak up if you want to ask any questions. But maybe a little bit of information the students might want to know about. You mentioned your bio, obviously experience with the club, the PowerCat financial stuff. And maybe, like, I know you had a really interesting internship during your law degree. Just maybe things students might want to keep an eye on for opportunities, for things that helped set you apart to get where you were going. And then if you have like a specific problem you've had to solve for any individual company, maybe that would be, something to share too. So I'm throwing a lot at you, but however you want to take it.
Sure. I solve problems all day for companies. That's all I do. So I guess some of my history and what helped me get to where I am. Obviously, the econ degree at K-State and taking some of the international business and international trade classes was really helpful and gave me a nice background and primer on trade. I kind of always knew I wanted to go to law school and do something business related, but I didn't know at that point that international trade was really a career that people could go into. I thought I would do something business law related, wasn't really sure. In my first internship in law school, I worked for Ernst & Young in their transfer pricing group. Transfer pricing was not really a concept I was familiar with, but it's essentially about evaluating whether transactions between related parties or related companies take place at arm's length or free from any non-market influences. Basically, that the relationship didn't influence the price. I thought that was really dry, and I definitely did not want to go into that. Then in my second year of law school, I was able to take an international trade class that was taught by a judge from the Court of International Trade. I thought it was super interesting. I was like, this makes so much sense to me, given the econ background. The class covered a lot of WTO level concepts, so global trade as a whole, how trade impacts the economy, just really made sense to me. So I made sure to really connect with that professor. I ended up being her teaching assistant one semester. And I also did a summer clerkship at the Court of International Trade. And throughout that, I was like, yes, this is what I want to do. So it may take you a couple tries to figure out what you want to do after college, but you'll find something. So I had that really good experience at the Court of International Trade. During my last year of law school, I ended up writing a journal article that was published about combining a couple of my interests, so international trade, economics, and space. I've always been really interested in space and astronomy. So what my article was about was how private sector space companies should be allowed to take advantage of the duty exemptions that NASA gets when it imports goods into the US. Because this was around the time they had announced that NASA was kind of going out of business, and companies like SpaceX, Blue Origin were going to be taking the role of NASA. So that was a really fun article to write. It ended up getting published. If you search hard enough on the internet, you can find it. Maybe I'll send it to you after. And so I knew that between all of those experiences, trade is really what I wanted to go into. And it helped me combine my econ degree and my law degree with something I found really interesting. And one of my favorite parts of my job is that even though I'm always dealing with trade and customs concepts, I get to work with clients in so many different industries. So I get to learn a lot, which I really like. And then I know you had said a problem. Or does anyone have any questions right now? Or I can keep talking. So I can talk about a couple of problems or some problems in general. Oh, hi.
Hi, so I had a quick question. I know a lot of the Trump administration was introducing a lot of new tariffs. Do you see the Biden administration doing the same? And if so, what kind of tariffs would they impose and upon who?
Oof. So before a lot of these tariffs are, or some of the tariffs at least, are implemented, typically an investigation has to be commenced by either the Department of Commerce, the International Trade Commission, or the US Trade Representative. I don't believe yet we have seen any new investigations initiated by the Biden administration, but it is still early. They have come out and said that the China tariffs aren't going anywhere anytime soon, which is not unexpected. That's also what we anticipated going into the election season as well. As far as new tariffs, honestly, I don't think we really have any idea. A lot of the focus right now has been on whether the China tariffs are staying or going. So we honestly really don't know about where the Biden administration is going with any other tariffs that might be imposed. I know that's not the answer you were looking for, but that's the answer we have. Any other questions? Whether it's about tariffs, my job, anything I do, personal questions. It's nice for me just to get to interact with people. I've been working from home.
Are you boxing, Katie? How's the 10 rounds going?
I've been working
Are you
from
doing
home.
that still?
Sorry?
Are you doing that still? I know you do Peloton. I see that on occasion, but
I'm
yeah,
still
you're
doing
used.
Peloton, for sure.
What's that?
I'm still doing Peloton, for sure. It's keeping me sane. I've been working for 13 months in my 600 square foot, 1-bedroom apartment now. I have seen one of my coworkers once in person in the last 13 months, and that's it. Everything else has been digital. And at least our firm has told us that we will be working remotely at least until September.
Oh.
So it's definitely been interesting to navigate that, but it's great for me to get to interact with you guys as some new people to talk to.
You should come see us. Things are a little more lax around here.
Once I'm vaccinated, I get my second one in a couple weeks.
Okay. All right. I got my second one a week and a half ago, I guess. Yeah. Knocked me on my butt for about a day.
Yeah, I plan to take the day off after. So.
Very good. Do you keep up with any of our, well, I'll ask you all this stuff later.
I do.
I didn't know, like, I know.
I follow
Like Jen,
the
I think, in the area and stuff.
I follow the Econ Club on Facebook, of course, the Econ department. Definitely still watch K-State football games on TV. Got my K-State shirt on.
All that.
I actually have a couple of my good friends from K-State actually live in New York City now, so we hang out to watch K-State games and Chiefs games all the time.
Very good. Very good. Well, I won't pressure you too much on any, unless you came up with an individual story about some business you saved a bunch of money or something, but you know.
I have some interesting ones and some quick ones. I do have one client that specifically related to the exclusions for PPE and COVID related products that me and my team have helped them get about $25 million back in duties. So that was a pretty big win. And they're actually the 5th largest importer into the United States. So it's a pretty big one. I like to talk more about the unique, but maybe not so impactful issues, but I'll save those for another time.
Okay. All right. Well, we're getting close to 8 o'clock, and now people in the chat can feel free to ask questions also if you want to, but we'll cut her off here unless there are any other questions. I really feel great that I think in some ways I've been a little more and as a group with our officers and stuff, we've been kind of outreaching more, knowing that travel isn't a restriction for our talk. So I'm really pleased with the caliber we've had this semester, and I thought this was great. So last chance for questions. Anybody wants to get up? Okay, let me just mention real quickly while I kind of have the people's attention. If you're here and you never signed up on the Zoom link, please let me know before you leave that you were here and I didn't get you down as being here. Just we like to have a record of everything. And I think Brock and Suzanne talked about our exciting news coming up and all the cool stuff we have. We aren't completely set on our next date. It's probably going to be 3 weeks from yesterday, the 26th. A lot of people requested to not have another meeting on a Tuesday because they haven't been able to come all semester. And I didn't realize that until recently. So we're encouraging Christina to come on a Monday, but yeah. So, and we have some sandwiches here that somebody needs to take. We have a lot of drinks that people need, not you on the Zoom. You don't need to come to Waters. We're going to leave, but those of us here need to clear out this food and drink that we're not supposed to have here anyway, before we leave. But let's thank our speaker and,
Great.
many people are standing, Katie. It's exciting. Standing ovation. So
Well, thanks.
anyway, thank you so much. And I may zoom in here and catch up a little bit. I do want that article though, please.
Okay, let me find it and I'll send it to you.
All right. I appreciate it. Sorry for the glitches and all that.
No problem.
Sorry to everybody for the glitches, folks. All right. Thanks.
Bye, guys. Thanks.
Bye-bye. I want you to. Yeah. Unless someone didn't get a sandwich. Did anybody get shorted a sandwich? Was that one of those yours? Yeah, Michelle has a sandwich with her name on it. We ought to let her have it. You were too polite to eat during the meeting? I mean,